The sunlight streamed through the dusty blinds of the small apartment, casting long shadows across the worn coffee table. Thomas Jackson couldn't take his eyes off the official letter in his hands. After reading it for the 5th time, he still found it hard to believe. Him, the new sheriff of Riverdale County. He ran his fingers over the county seal at the top of the paper. 15 years of his life had led to this moment. From walking the beat in the roughest neighborhoods to climbing the ranks as a detective in the neighboring county, his journey hadn't been easy. Every promotion had come with twice the work and 3 times the scrutiny that his white colleagues faced. Thomas set the letter down and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The neighboring county where he built his reputation was more diverse, more accepting. Riverdale was different, mostly white, set in its ways, and now, unexpectedly, his responsibility. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. "So, did you get the letter?" It was his mother, her voice bubbling with barely contained excitement. "I did, Mom," Thomas said, unable to keep the smile from his voice despite his concerns. "My son, the sheriff. Your father would have been so proud." Her voice cracked slightly at the mention of his father, who'd passed away 3 years ago. "The first black sheriff in Riverdale's history," Thomas added, the weight of those words settling on his shoulders. "That's exactly what worries me." "Now don't you start with that," his mother chided gently. "The county board chose you because you're the best person for the job. Your record speaks for itself." Thomas knew there was more to it than that. The previous sheriff had retired suddenly after accusations of corruption and mismanagement. The board needed someone untainted by local politics, someone who could restore trust. An outsider with an impeccable record. "I've got 1 week before I officially start," Thomas said, changing the subject. "I think I'll drive around the county tomorrow, get a feel for the place." After hanging up, Thomas pulled out a map of Riverdale County. It wasn't large, 3 small towns, some farming communities, and a lot of open country. He traced the main roads with his finger, trying to commit them to memory. Later that evening, his brother Dion came by with a bottle of sparkling cider to celebrate. No champagne. Thomas teased as they sat on his small balcony. "You're about to be the law, little brother. Figured we should keep it legal," Dion laughed, pouring the cider into 2 coffee mugs, the only clean dishes Thomas had. As night fell, they talked about the challenges ahead. Dion had always been the practical one. "You know some of those deputies aren't going to like taking orders from you," he said bluntly. Thomas nodded. "I've been the only black officer in a department before. I know what I'm walking into." "This is different," Dion insisted. "You're not just joining the team, you're leading it. Some of those good old boys have been there for decades." "Then they'll have decades of experience to share," Thomas replied evenly. "I'm not going in looking for trouble." After Dion left, Thomas stayed up late, researching Riverdale's crime statistics, budget issues, and community concerns. The more he read, the more he understood why the board had looked outside for new leadership. The department needed fresh eyes, unbiased perspective. As he finally prepared for bed, Thomas looked again at the letter of appointment. Beyond the official language and formalities, it represented a chance. A chance to show that good policing wasn't about power but protection, not about force but fairness. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours, he would experience firsthand just how much change was needed in his new department, or that his first test as sheriff would come before he even took the oath of office. The dashboard thermometer read 97 degrees as Thomas drove his blue sedan across the county line. His AC struggled against the summer heat, the vents blowing air that was cool enough to survive, but not enough to be comfortable. Sweat dampened the back of his simple button-up shirt as he rolled the sleeves to his elbows. He'd chosen not to wear anything that screamed law enforcement. No badge, no uniform, no gun on his hip. Today he was just a regular guy getting to know the place that would soon be his responsibility. The road stretched out before him, cutting through golden fields and patches of dense woodland. It was beautiful country, peaceful in a way his current jurisdiction wasn't. Around noon, his stomach growled. Thomas spotted a roadside diner with a faded sign reading May's Kitchen and pulled into the gravel parking lot. Several trucks were parked outside, along with 2 white patrol cars from the Riverdale County Sheriff's Department. Perfect, Thomas thought. I can observe some of my future deputies in action. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The cool air inside was a welcome relief from the heat. The diner had the comfortable, worn-in feel of a place that had served the community for generations. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, and a counter with spinning stools stretched along one wall. The smell of fried food and coffee filled the air. Thomas chose a booth near the back where he could see most of the diner. He noticed the deputies immediately, 2 men in tan uniforms sitting at the counter, backs turned to him. One was older with gray hair cropped close to his scalp. The other was younger with broad shoulders and a military-style haircut. A waitress with flow on her name tag took his order, a cheeseburger with fries and sweet tea. While waiting for his food, Thomas pulled out a small notebook and jotted down ideas about community outreach programs he wanted to implement. So absorbed was he in his planning that he didn't notice how the deputy's conversation had quieted, or how they occasionally glanced at him in the large mirror behind the counter. His food arrived, and Thomas ate slowly, savoring the home-style cooking. He left a generous tip and nodded politely to the deputies as he walked past them to pay his bill. Their eyes followed him, but neither nodded back. Back outside, the heat hit him like a physical wall. Thomas loosened another button on his shirt and dug in his pocket for his car keys. That's when he noticed the deputies had followed him out and were standing by their patrol cars, watching him. Afternoon, Thomas called, trying to be friendly. Neither responded. He had just reached his car when he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind him. "Hold up there," a deep voice commanded. Thomas turned to find both deputies approaching, hands resting casually near their holsters. The older one had hard lines around his mouth and eyes that had seen too much. His nameplate read Officer Wells. The younger one stood slightly behind, his face unreadable beneath mirrored sunglasses. "Something wrong, officers?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice level and his hands visible. "Haven't seen you around here before," Wells said, looking Thomas over from head to toe. "Where you coming from with those out-of-county plates?" "Just passing through, getting to know the area," Thomas answered truthfully. "Getting to know the area for what purpose?" The younger deputy stepped forward, his stance aggressive. His nameplate read Officer Briggs. "No particular purpose," Thomas said, feeling the situation shift. He recognized the look in Wells' eyes. He'd seen it before, been on the receiving end of it before. "Mind if we see some ID?" Wells asked in a tone that wasn't really asking. Thomas slowly reached for his wallet. "No problem at all." "What's that notebook you were writing in?" Briggs demanded. "You taking notes on the area? On the department?" Thomas felt the first stirrings of real concern. This wasn't just routine questioning anymore. "Just some personal notes," he said, handing over his driver's license. "I'm actually in law enforcement myself. Detective in Millbrook County." Instead of easing the tension, his words seemed to make it worse. Wells and Briggs exchanged looks. "You're a cop," Wells said, disbelief evident in his voice. "Let's see your badge then." "I don't have it with me. I'm off duty just." "Convenient," Briggs cut him off. "Out-of-county guy, taking notes, claiming to be a cop but can't prove it." Thomas realized with growing unease that this misunderstanding could quickly become dangerous. Thomas held his ground as the 2 deputies circled him like sharks. The sun beat down mercilessly, and he could feel sweat trickling down his back. A few customers from the diner had wandered outside, watching the scene unfold from a safe distance. "Look, I understand you're just doing your job," Thomas said calmly, reaching for his phone. "I can call my captain in Millbrook. He'll confirm who I am." Officer Wells stepped forward quickly. "Put that phone away, slowly." Thomas froze, then carefully returned his phone to his pocket. The situation was escalating faster than he'd anticipated. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Briggs ordered, his hand now resting openly on his holster. "Is that really necessary?" Thomas asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Are you refusing to comply with a direct order?" Wells asked, his face hardening. Thomas knew this crossroads all too well, both as a law enforcement officer and as a black man. Pride told him to stand his ground, but experience told him that could end badly, very badly. He turned slowly and placed his hands on the hot metal of his car roof. The heat stung his palms, but he didn't flinch. "Feet back, spread 'em," Briggs barked, kicking Thomas's feet wider apart. As Wells patted him down, Thomas spoke quietly. I'm going to be the new sheriff here starting next Monday. My appointment letter is in my briefcase on the passenger seat." Both deputies paused for just a moment, then Wells laughed. "Sure you are, and I'm the governor's son." "You can check," Thomas began, but Briggs cut him off. "We've had reports of drug trafficking through this county. Out-of-county vehicle, driver acting suspicious, taking notes on local law enforcement." Briggs pulled Thomas's hands behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists, and now impersonating an officer, that's a serious offense. "I'm not impersonating anyone," Thomas insisted, his heart pounding as the cuffs tightened. "My ID is legitimate. Call Millbrook PD. Ask for Captain Rails. He'll vouch for me." Wells looked at Thomas's driver's license again. "Thomas Jackson," he read aloud. "We'll run your information, but until then, you're being detained." The small crowd of onlookers had grown. Thomas could see their expressions, some concerned, others merely curious, a few openly hostile. No one stepped forward to help. Briggs gripped Thomas's arm and marched him toward one of the patrol cars. "You picked the wrong county to cause trouble in," he muttered, low enough that only Thomas could hear. The patrol car's back door opened, and Thomas was pushed inside. The seat was worn vinyl, cracked in places from years of use. With his hands cuffed behind him, he had to sit at an awkward angle. "Wait," Thomas said as Wells prepared to close the door. "My briefcase, in my car. The appointment letter is right there." "We'll get to that," Wells replied dismissively. "After we run your information and make some calls." The door slammed shut. Through the window, Thomas watched as the two deputies moved away from the car, talking between themselves. The patrol car's windows were barely cracked open, not enough to provide any real airflow. Within minutes, the interior of the car began to heat up. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, already feeling sweat soaking through his shirt. The patrol car was parked in direct sunlight, with no shade in sight. Through the windshield, he could see Wells and Briggs had returned to the diner. They sat at a table by the window where they could keep an eye on him while enjoying the air conditioning inside. Thomas tried to stay calm. This wasn't his first experience with prejudice in uniform, but it was the first time he'd been on this side of a detention. The irony wasn't lost on him, the incoming sheriff, handcuffed in the back of his own department's patrol car. He tested the cuffs, but they were secured properly. The back doors couldn't be opened from the inside. The partition between the front and back seats was solid. He was trapped. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The temperature in the car climbed steadily. Thomas's breathing became more labored in the stifling heat. He knew the dangers of being left in a hot car, had seen the devastating effects firsthand during his years on the force. "Hey," he called out, hoping someone might hear him. "Officers, it's getting too hot in here." But Wells and Briggs seemed in no hurry to return. Through the diner window, Thomas could see them laughing over cups of coffee, occasionally glancing his way. A digital thermometer on the patrol car's dashboard caught his eye. It read 104 degrees and climbing. 15 minutes turned into 20. Thomas's dress shirt clung to his skin, completely soaked through with sweat. His mouth felt like cotton, and his vision had started to blur around the edges. The car had become an oven, the air thick and almost impossible to breathe. He tried once more to get the deputy's attention, kicking the partition between the seats. "Officers, please." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hoarse and distant. Through the windows of the diner, he could see Wells and Briggs were still at their table. They had ordered food now, plates of something that Thomas's clouded mind couldn't make out. Occasionally, one would glance toward the patrol car, but neither made a move to check on him. Thomas knew the dangers of heat stroke all too well. As a patrol officer, he'd responded to cases where children or pets had been left in hot cars. Some hadn't survived even 15 minutes. He'd been in this car for nearly 25 now, and the dashboard thermometer had stopped climbing only because it couldn't display temperatures above 110 degrees. He tried to control his breathing, to conserve what little energy he had left. Panic would only make things worse, raising his core temperature even faster. "Stay conscious," he whispered to himself. "Stay conscious." Inside the diner, a young waitress with curly hair pulled back in a ponytail kept looking out at the patrol car. She'd noticed the man inside when she'd gone to take out the trash earlier. Now, as she refilled the deputy's coffee cups for the third time, she couldn't ignore her growing concern. "Excuse me, officers," she said hesitantly, "but that man in your car, he doesn't look so good." Officer Wells barely glanced up from his plate of meatloaf. "He's fine, Angie. Just cooling his heels a bit." "But it's almost 100 degrees out there," she pressed, "and your car's been sitting in direct sunlight for nearly half an hour." Briggs frowned at her. "We know how to do our jobs. He's a person of interest in an ongoing investigation." Angie bit her lip, glancing again at the car where Thomas's head now leaned against the window, his eyes half closed. Making a decision, she walked back to the kitchen and filled a large cup with ice water. "What do you think you're doing?" her manager asked as she headed for the door. "The right thing," she answered simply. Outside, the heat was like walking into a wall. By the time Angie reached the patrol car, sweat beaded on her forehead. She peered through the window and was alarmed by what she saw. The man inside was clearly in distress. His dark skin had taken on an ashen pallor, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. She tapped on the window. Sir, can you hear me?" Thomas turned his head slowly, as if it weighed 100 pounds. He blinked at the young woman, trying to focus on her face. "I brought you some water," she said, trying the door handle only to find it locked, as expected. Through the crack in the window, she tried to pass the cup, but the opening was too narrow. Water spilled down the side of the car. "Stand back from the vehicle." Officer Wells's voice boomed from behind her. He had noticed her actions from inside and moved surprisingly quickly for his size. "He needs help," Angie insisted, not budging. "Look at him. He's suffering from heat exhaustion or worse." "This is police business," Briggs said, coming up behind Wells. "Get back inside, Angie." But the confrontation had drawn attention. Several customers had come outside to see what was happening. Cars passing on the highway slowed, drivers rubbernecking at the scene unfolding in the diner parking lot. One car actually pulled in, a silver SUV with government plates. A middle-aged man in a suit stepped out, his expression changing from curiosity to shock as he recognized the man in the patrol car. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, striding toward the group. "Is that Thomas Jackson?" Wells turned, irritation clear on his face. "And who might you be?" The man drew himself up to his full height. "Howard Mitchell, County Commissioner." His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. "And unless I'm mistaken, that's our new sheriff you've got locked in the back of that car." A murmur went through the small crowd that had gathered. Briggs and Wells exchanged uneasy glances. "New sheriff?" someone in the crowd repeated. Thomas managed to lift his head at the sound of Mitchell's voice, relief washing over his heat-strained features. Help had arrived, but he was starting to wonder if it was already too late. The edges of his vision were growing darker, and each breath felt like inhaling fire. Commissioner Mitchell's words hung in the air like the summer heat. "That's our new sheriff you've got locked in that car." For a moment, nobody moved. The crowd that had gathered fell silent, processing this bombshell. Then everything happened at once. "Get him out of there now," Mitchell barked, his face reddening with anger. Officer Wells fumbled with his keys, suddenly looking much less sure of himself. "There must be some mistake," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "The only mistake," Mitchell said, following Wells to the patrol car, "was leaving a man to cook in a car on a day like this. I don't care if he was the county dog catcher. This is inexcusable." Briggs hovered nearby, his earlier confidence evaporated. "We were following protocol for suspicious individuals," he offered weakly. Mitchell turned on him. "Your protocol includes torture by heat stroke. I'd be very interested to see that in writing, officer." The car door finally swung open. A wave of superheated air rushed out, so intense that Wells took a step back. Thomas slumped sideways, barely conscious. Without the door supporting him, he would have fallen face first onto the gravel. "Someone call an ambulance," Angie shouted, pushing past the officers with a fresh cup of ice water. Thomas's wrists were still cuffed behind his back. The metal had heated in the car, leaving angry red marks on his skin. Mitchell crouched beside him, loosening his collar. "Mr. Jackson? Thomas, can you hear me?" Mitchell's voice seemed to come from very far away. Thomas tried to respond, but his tongue felt swollen in his mouth. The world tilted and spun around him. Hands helped him out of the car and onto the ground, where the gravel pressed into his knees. Someone was fumbling with the handcuffs. "Get those off him," Mitchell demanded. "Sir, we can't just," Wells began. "Those cuffs come off now, or your badge follows," Mitchell said, his voice deadly quiet. The key turned and blessed relief flooded Thomas's wrists as the handcuffs fell away. His arms fell limply to his sides, painfully numb from being restrained for so long. Angie pressed the cup of water to his lips. "Small sips," she instructed gently. The water felt like heaven. Thomas managed 2 small swallows before coughing. His body was desperate for moisture, but unable to process it quickly. Someone had placed a wet towel on the back of his neck. Another person held an umbrella to shield him from the relentless sun. Through his blurred vision, Thomas could make out a small crowd of people, some from the diner, others who had stopped on the highway. They were taking pictures, recording videos on their phones. "Ambulance is on the way," a voice called out. "ETA 5 minutes." Thomas could hear Mitchell giving someone a dressing down. 15 years of law enforcement experience, appointed by unanimous vote, background in community policing. Gradually, the world began to come back into focus. Thomas took another sip of water, feeling strength slowly returning to his limbs. "Are you with us, Mr. Jackson?" Mitchell asked, crouching down again. Thomas nodded weakly. "Yes," he managed to croak. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Mitchell said grimly. "This should never have happened." He looked up at Wells and Briggs, who stood awkwardly nearby. "These two have some serious explaining to do." The wail of an approaching siren cut through the buzz of conversation. People moved back to make room for the ambulance. "Officer Wells," Thomas said, his voice still rough but stronger now. With effort, he pushed himself to a sitting position. "Officer Briggs." Both deputies looked at him, a mixture of embarrassment and apprehension on their faces. "I believe," Thomas said slowly, "this qualifies as one hell of a first day on the job." An uncomfortable laugh rippled through the crowd. Some people looked away, embarrassed to be witnessing such a public humiliation of the officers. Others continued filming, no doubt already uploading videos to social media. The ambulance pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. 2 paramedics jumped out and hurried over with a stretcher. "Heat exhaustion, possibly heading toward heat stroke," Mitchell informed them. "He's been locked in a patrol car for at least 30 minutes in this heat." The female paramedic shot a disgusted look at the deputies as she knelt beside Thomas, taking his pulse. "BP's low, heart rate elevated," she reported to her partner. "Let's get him cooled down and to the hospital." As they helped Thomas onto the stretcher, he caught sight of his reflection in the ambulance's side mirror. His face was ashen, his eyes bloodshot. He barely recognized himself. "This isn't over," he heard Mitchell telling the deputies. "Not by a long shot." Thomas closed his eyes as the paramedics lifted the stretcher. He knew Mitchell was right. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. In 5 days, he would be sworn in as Riverdale County's new sheriff. And his first order of business had just become crystal clear. The hospital room was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the patrol car where Thomas had nearly lost consciousness. An IV dripped fluids into his arm, helping his body recover from the dangerous dehydration. The doctor had explained that his core temperature had reached 103 degrees, dangerously high, but thankfully caught before permanent damage could occur. Thomas stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in his mind. His phone on the bedside table hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. The story had exploded across social media. Someone had posted a video titled "Cops Lock Future Boss in Hot Car," which had already gathered thousands of views and angry comments. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His brother Dean entered, his face tight with concern and barely contained anger. "You look awful," Dean said bluntly, pulling a chair up to the bed. Thomas managed a weak smile. "You should see the other guys." His attempt at humor fell flat as Dean shook his head. "This isn't funny, Thomas. You could have died in that car." "I know," Thomas admitted. "Believe me, I know better than most what happens to people left in hot cars." Dean set a folder on the bed. Mitchell dropped this off. The deputy's personnel files. Wells has 3 complaints of excessive force in his record. Briggs is newer, but already has 1 racial profiling complaint that was dismissed. Thomas nodded slowly. Not surprising. The current sheriff called a press conference, Dan continued, tried to downplay the whole thing as a regrettable misunderstanding, said his deputies were just being thorough in their investigation of a suspicious person. Let me guess, Thomas said. He never mentioned they left me in a hot car for half an hour while they drank coffee. Not a word. But the waitress, Angie, she's already given 3 interviews telling exactly what happened. And those cell phone videos don't lie. Dean paused. People are calling for the deputies to be fired. Some want charges filed. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. The painkillers were making him groggy, but his mind was clear enough to recognize the crossroads he had reached. His first official act as sheriff would define his entire tenure. What are you thinking? Dean asked, studying his brother's face. Before Thomas could answer, there was another knock. Commissioner Mitchell entered, along with a woman Thomas didn't recognize. Mr. Jackson, Mitchell said formally, this is District Attorney Patton. She wanted to speak with you about pressing charges. The DA was a sharp-looking woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a professional bun. Mr. Jackson, she said, what happened to you today was inexcusable. We have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges of reckless endangerment, possibly even attempted involuntary manslaughter. Thomas shifted in the hospital bed, wincing slightly. Thank you for coming, but I've been thinking about this all afternoon. The county would support whatever decision you make, Mitchell added. But those officers clearly broke protocol and endangered your life. The room fell silent as they waited for Thomas to speak. He could feel the weight of their expectations. In 5 days, he said finally, I'm going to be sworn in as sheriff, and my first responsibility will be to this department, the same department that employs officers Wells and Briggs. All the more reason to make an example of them, DA Patton argued. Show everyone that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Thomas shook his head. Making an example of them would satisfy a lot of people's anger, including my own, but it wouldn't change the culture that allowed this to happen. He gestured to the pile of messages on his phone. Social media is already divided. Half the county sees me as a victim of racist cops. The other half thinks I'm an outsider trying to cause trouble. If I start my tenure by firing or prosecuting these officers, I'll only deepen that divide. So you're just going to let them get away with it? Dean asked incredulously. No, Thomas said firmly. But there's a difference between punishment and change. The entire department needs oversight and retraining, not just 2 sacrificial officers. Mitchell frowned. The public will expect some kind of action. And they'll get it, Thomas promised. But not revenge, real change. He shifted again, sitting up straighter despite his discomfort. I need to speak with officers Wells and Briggs. They're on administrative leave, Mitchell said. I know, but I'm not waiting until I'm in office. I want to meet with them tomorrow. Thomas's voice was quiet but determined. And I need you to arrange something else. What's that? Mitchell asked. A community forum, open to the public. I want every resident of this county to hear directly from me what happened today and what I plan to do about it. Thomas glanced at his phone, still vibrating with notifications. Before the rumors and social media posts create a story we can't control. DA Patton looked skeptical. That's a risky move. Being left in that car was risky, Thomas replied. This is necessary. 3 years later, Thomas stood at the back of the Riverdale County Sheriff's Department, watching the training session with quiet satisfaction. Officers paired off in the summer heat, practicing proper detention procedures while their partners monitored for signs of distress. A timer beeped, and they switched roles. Remember, the instructor called out, no detainee should ever be left unattended in a vehicle for more than 5 minutes, regardless of weather conditions. And in temperatures above 75 degrees, you use the shaded area with water access. No exceptions. Thomas nodded to himself. The training area had been his first major department upgrade, a covered space with benches and water fountains where officers could safely process individuals without bringing them into the station or leaving them in vehicles. Deputy Wells approached, clipboard in hand. All officers are now certified in heat emergency response, Sheriff. His tone was professional, respectful, a far cry from their first encounter 3 years ago. Good work, Deputy, Thomas said, signing the training log. How are the community ride-alongs going? Full schedule this month, Wells replied. Got the pastor from First Baptist riding with Garcia next week, and 3 high school seniors signed up for the Career Shadow Day. Thomas couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The community forum he'd held from his hospital bed 3 years ago had been a turning point. Instead of firing the deputies who'd endangered his life, he'd instituted mandatory retraining and a department-wide overhaul. Every officer now wore body cameras. Civilian oversight committees reviewed complaints. Monthly community meetings gave residents direct access to department leadership. Not everyone had agreed with his approach. His brother Dion had called him crazy for not pressing charges. Several community activists had demanded the deputies be fired. But Thomas had stood firm on his philosophy. Punishment might satisfy anger, but only systematic change would prevent history from repeating itself. The department's break room door opened, and Deputy Briggs emerged with a group of teenagers, participants in the Youth Police Academy Thomas had started his second year in office. And this is where we monitor all patrol cars, Briggs was explaining. Each vehicle has temperature sensors that alert dispatch if the interior gets above 80 degrees with someone inside. One of the teens spotted Thomas. Sheriff Jackson, we were just talking about the hot car incident in our ethics class. Thomas smiled. Were you now? Yes, sir, the teen continued. Deputy Briggs was telling us how it changed the whole department. Briggs looked slightly uncomfortable but nodded. I tell them the truth, Sheriff, about how I almost killed my boss before I even met him, and how instead of firing me, you made me become a better officer. The radio on Thomas's belt crackled. Sheriff, Commissioner Mitchell is here to see you. Tell him I'll be right there, Thomas responded. He turned back to the group. Judy calls. Keep up the good work. In his office, Mitchell waited with a newspaper in hand. 3 years older but still as sharp as ever, the commissioner had become one of Thomas's strongest allies. Have you seen this? Mitchell asked, handing over the paper. The headline read, Riverdale County Sheriff's Department sets state standard for reform. The article detailed how departments across the state were adopting Riverdale's training programs and community engagement initiatives. Page 3 is even better, Mitchell said. Thomas turned the page to find election results. He'd won his first proper election by a landslide, 84% of the vote. Not bad for someone who started his career here locked in the back of a patrol car, Mitchell said with a wry smile. Thomas set the paper down. That wasn't the beginning of my career here. It was the beginning of this department's transformation. A knock at the door interrupted them. Angie from the diner, now Officer Angie Peters, poked her head in. She'd been among the first to apply when Thomas expanded the department, citing the hot car incident as her inspiration to enter law enforcement. Sorry to interrupt, Sheriff, but the community center called. They're ready for you to speak at the youth program whenever you can make it. Thomas nodded. Tell them I'll be there in 20 minutes. After she left, Mitchell looked at Thomas thoughtfully. You know, when you refused to fire those deputies, I thought you were making a mistake. I couldn't understand how you could work alongside the men who nearly killed you. Some days were harder than others, Thomas admitted. But I didn't become sheriff to punish people. I became sheriff to protect this community and make this department better. He glanced out the window at the training session still underway in the yard. Deputy Wells was demonstrating proper techniques to a new recruit. Deputy Briggs was loading water bottles into patrol cars, standard equipment now. The easy path would have been to fire them, press charges, and start fresh, Thomas said. But real change never comes from taking the easy path. Mitchell nodded slowly. Well, the results speak for themselves. He picked up the newspaper again. 84%. I'd say the people of Riverdale County agree with your approach. Thomas smiled as he grabbed his hat. That's the thing about transformation, Commissioner. When it's real, everyone can see it.